Excellent. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled to see that we already have over 60 people here, counting. That's really great. And today we're really lucky to have Dr. Fantasy Lozada here to speak with us. So Dr. Lozada earned her PhD in lifespan developmental psychology from North Carolina State University, and then completed her postdoctoral training at the University of Michigan as a National Science Foundation postdoc research fellow with the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context. So she's currently an assistant professor of developmental psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she's the director of the School, Home, and Internet Context of Emotional Development, or the SHIELD Lab. And her work explores the interplay of culture, race, and emotions, and predictors of the social and emotional development of Black and Brown children across contexts. So Dr. Lozada's work has been published in Child Development, the Journal of Child and Family Studies, the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, Emotion Review, the Journal of Black Psychology, and Cultural and Ethnic Minority Psychology. And today she's going to be delivering a talk titled, "Our Emotions Aren't for Everyone, Understanding Black Youth's Emotional Development." So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fantasy Lozada.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I've been having a really great time meeting with your students, meeting with some of the faculty. It's been a really awesome little virtual visit. And, you know, I know that it would have been even more amazing in person. So thank you so much for joining me in our virtual space today. And I will go ahead and apologize that I do have a 1-year-old who's quite vocal, who you may hear from time to time, but hopefully not too much, that it would be distracting. So can I go ahead and share my screen? Let's see. Perfect. And I'm hoping that this works out well. Okay. So I'm really excited to talk with you all about my work today, work that sort of has been a long time coming. As a junior scholar, as a graduate student, I became really invested in really trying to understand the emotion socialization processes of various types of family, but particularly ethnic racial minority families, and have sort of returned back to this love of understanding the role of emotion in families. And but as I was doing this work as a graduate student, I was acutely aware that I was being trained in understanding emotion socialization from a cultural perspective without having explicit sort of understanding about the ways that race does and does not have an impact for African-American families. And so from that, I did a postdoc at the University of Michigan with the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context with some of the leading researchers in understanding Black experience from both a racialized perspective and also a positive perspective. And so that is really the work that you'll see here today in terms of its influence on the ways that I think about understanding Black children's emotional development and the ways that Black families socialize them. So, there we go. Black families, just like all families, come in all different shapes and sizes, and they have a variety of different experiences that, you know, it's not just one size fits all, and that's what I hope you take away from my talk today. In particular, that when we try to understand the processes that happen within Black families with regard to children's emotional development, that it's important to not just focus on comparative approaches, but to focus on within group approaches, to be able to understand the heterogeneity of Black families. And so these Black families here, you see that they're all, of course, posed and smiling in perfect family picture form, right? But we all know, we all come from families, that's not always the case. The picture looks one way, and then there are times when, you know, this young girl here comes home upset, or is at the house upset after arguing with a sibling, and is experiencing a great deal of sadness and frustration. And so there's ways that families need to negotiate and help her regulate and deal with and understand the emotions that she's feeling from her sibling interactions. And you know, this young man here, he may come home from school after having a particularly hard day of learning, but also peer interactions. And he himself may be finding himself frustrated and needing some support from families, but he may go into his room and for the rest of the evening sort of spend it there trying to regulate his own emotions and make sense of his experiences. And there are ways that Black families support that. And then something that's more recent, not necessarily more recent, but more on the minds of researchers and the country at large, is just the experience of African American youth as they are continually exposed to police coverage on police brutality against Black Americans and of Black boys in particular as well, the boys that are teenagers, not much older than this young man here himself. And the meaning making that African American youth are going through at this moment in time with regard to what does the moment mean for how they feel about themselves and about how other people view African Americans. Do Black lives really indeed matter? That is not just an experience in and of itself that has relevance for one's own racial identity, but also for one's emotional development, because there are real emotions that are elicited by race-related experiences. And so African American families are undoubtedly navigating generalized emotional eliciting experiences for their youth and with their youth in sort of co-regulation fashion, but they are also navigating these experiences that are race-related, and they are faced with needing to sometimes promote messaging and socialization that is addressing both the emotion and race. And this is really one of my favorite quotes that depict this in a really real way is from Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And he is recounting the incident in which his son stayed up to see the verdict for the Mike Brown case. And he said, "You stayed up till 11 p.m. that night waiting for the announcement of an indictment. And when it was announced that there was none, you said, 'I've got to go.' And you went into your room and I heard you crying. I came in 5 minutes after and I didn't hug you and I didn't comfort you. I did not tell you that it would be okay because I have never thought it would be okay. What I told you is what your grandparents tried to tell me, that this is your country, that this is your world, that this is your body, and you must find some way to live within all of it." And so what I want you to notice here from this quote is that there are conflicting things happening here. It is very clear that Mr. Coates is trying to support his son, that he's trying to support the emotional experience that he's currently having, but that he's also trying to support his understanding of the racialized world in which he lives in and what that means for him as a Black male. And so there is intentionality behind what he says when he says that, "I heard you crying," number one, recognizing that I understood that you were having this emotional experience. I knew that you were upset. But he says that I didn't hug you and I didn't comfort you. And hugging your child and comforting your child is a natural response that any parent would engage in when their child is experiencing some intense negative emotion. And in the emotion socialization literature, these types of behaviors are thought of in terms of supportive emotion socialization. But that he didn't engage in this supportive emotion socialization didn't mean that he was not supporting his child's emotion. It didn't mean he wasn't supporting what his son was feeling in that moment. But in this particular instance, he prioritized the racial socialization, the racial message that he needed to provide to his son about the meaning of what it is to be a Black person in this country. And so I hope that some of what you'll see today in my talk is that African American parents are negotiating both of these types of socialization agendas, sometimes prioritizing racial socialization, sometimes prioritizing emotion socialization, and that if we're really trying to understand children's emotion-related development, we need to know a little bit about what's happening with regard to their racial socialization and race-related experiences and what's happening with them emotionally more broadly. And so today I'm going to talk to you about some of my work that is on Black family emotion socialization, and particularly Black parents' perceptions of race and emotional development, and some work that comes out of a mixed method study there. And then I'll talk to you about where I'm going next with regard to this idea of emotional code switching through a study, which is my family expression and emotional life study, and try to give you some conclusions and implications and wrap up with some questions and answers. And I will try to not be too long-winded. So when we're thinking about children's emotions, as many of you know from the work that you do, that emotions are central and salient to social relationships broadly. Even beginning in early childhood, parents and preschool teachers, caregivers, they spend a lot of time socializing and aiding in children's emotion regulation. Within schools, by the time that the children start, emotions and perceptions of teacher emotional support are vital for teacher and student relationships. They're vital for peer relationships, in fact, and they're also important to students' goals and their self-efficacy and their problem solving, sort of, their ability to be able to show up in the academic space and to be prepared to learn and to be able to engage with the material. Emotions are integral to all of these processes. But there is a wealth of literature that describes the misinterpretation of emotions, that there is outgroup bias in emotion recognition, for instance, that there are implicit biases that show up in the ways that others read and interpret others' emotions, the interpretations of anger and frustration, for instance. European American or white adults also linking negative emotions or anger with African American faces. There's some more recent work on that as well. Some of our own research with pre-service teachers in providing some validation for an implicit bias emotion recognition task that we have created. We have found that there is worse recognition for African American emotion than white emotion among these pre-service teachers, and higher anger bias for African American faces in comparison to European American or white faces. And that is in the context of there being no anger. So anger is not being expressed, but that they're reading anger into the faces that they're seeing. And these are pre-service teachers who have engaged with or have had some experience with sort of diversity related training with regard to educational contexts. And there's evidence of teacher misinterpretation of emotional cues and student behaviors more broadly than that. And so there's this, in trying to understand Black children's emotional development, it's important to understand that there is a great deal of misinterpretation of their emotions as they are expressed, and that is a consideration for Black parents as they are raising their children and helping them to understand their emotions. And understanding and managing your emotions while being a Black person, it's important to understand, as I've been saying, that African American children, they navigate their emotions and develop their skills in a particularly racialized context where their emotions are subject to the stereotypes and misinterpretations of what I've just described before, and that has consequences for their community and classroom interactions. So that has consequences, as you can imagine, for their interactions with unfamiliar adults in the community. And as we are most acutely aware with the authority figures such as police in the community, it has consequences for the rates of discipline that African American Black students experience, in which we know that they are disproportionately experiencing rates of exclusionary disciplinary practices, in particular being sent out of the classroom and being seen as disruptive. And so this has ultimately implications for their relationship with teachers. And so that the experience of misinterpretation of emotions, misinterpretation of emotion expression with teachers has real consequences for children's academic success in a variety of ways, we believe. Additionally, in thinking about managing our emotions while Black, it's important to be said that race-related events and experiences tend to be emotional in general, and that may sound like a very intuitive type of statement, and there is work that discusses in terms of racial stress and racial discrimination and the extent to which it causes stress in African Americans, but it's not always just about stress or negative emotions in general. There are a number of race-related or cultural experiences that also elicit positive emotions, for instance, thinking about racial pride messages, or learning about one's racial heritage, or achievements of members of your racial community, that these things can evoke pride, in addition to the negative experiences or the negative emotions that children may feel in relation to experiences of racial discrimination. But regardless, that that parents are helping their children navigate multiple types of race-related experiences that also elicit emotion, that also require some understanding about regulation or understanding about expression and what's appropriate. And then, of course, emotions also just impact attention, appraisals, and decision-making and social interactions more broadly, and that the extent to which emotions are paired with certain types of social interactions, with particular types of social experiences, that likely has consequences for a variety of outcomes for Black youth. And particularly racial identity development is something that we've been thinking a little bit more about. And that, for instance, if African American youth tend to have some more positive emotions elicited from racialized experiences that they have, in the examples that I was giving of racial socialization, and parents teaching their children about their heritage and their culture, is the positive emotion what is the impotence for developing positive racial identity development. So we've been thinking a little bit about the role of emotion as a fixative for socialization that's happening in the home, and what particularly racial socialization, and what that means for children's outcomes later. I just want to provide you with a few sort of frameworks that I'm thinking about broadly with regard to my work, and how my work sort of answers or speaks to those frameworks. Now, this here is just really depicting historical perspectives of African American youth's emotional development. As we know, it's historically from a deficit, comparative, and intervention type of perspective, with this idea of what is the problem with Black kids' emotions, or what is the problem with Black kids' behaviors, that they exhibit aggressive behaviors or delinquent behaviors, that African American families, and particularly mothers, may be cold or dismissive or discouraging towards their children and their children's emotions, and that African American youth, that they have these impoverished experiences of growing up in poverty and high exposure to violence, and that this sort of represents Black children as a whole and Black families as a whole, and that this is, there's some need for intervention or intervening in how these experiences then relate to problematic behaviors in Black children. But as theoretical perspectives have progressed, for instance, Oscar Barber in 1993, he put forth a model of African American children's emotional development that was highlighting the role of culture and ethnicity in the contribution to socio-emotional development. And that while there are these experiences, and experiences that are related to poverty, experiences that are related to segregated lived experiences, and that this can be associated with, or are predictors of problematic behavior or externalizing behavior for Black youth, that there are structures in place that make it so. Because African American families are disproportionately exposed to experiences of racial discrimination and experiences of poverty. And this understanding of this socio-historical piece was really important to recognize and engage with. He also talked about how self-esteem in response to societal devaluation was an indicator of socio-emotional functioning, and that just wondering what the sort of diagnostic conceptions and assessment implications there were for understanding at least the experiences of racism and discrimination in understanding Black youth's emotional development. And even more recently, this is a theoretical model that speaks to my work quite well, is work by Angel Dunbar and colleagues in putting forth that racial and emotion socialization are overlapping constructs that have consequence for thinking about Black children's emotional development, specifically a focus or an emphasis on Black children's emotion regulation and their emotion understanding. But here it's this understanding that there is this negotiation of both racial messages and emotion messages, and that these agendas converge, that emotion socialization is an emotion-centered coping dimension, and specifically that it's meant for preparation for bias, that Black families are preparing their children for the potential experiences of discrimination that they may encounter in their lives, and that this adaptive racial emotion socialization is encompassing of messages about the experience of racial discrimination and how to cope with that. It's encompassing messages that are saying, that are trying to support and facilitate their children's emotional awareness and understanding and regulation, but it is also trying to protect them by teaching them that there are times and places when one should suppress their emotions or protect their emotions from being seen by other people as a form of protection for oneself. And so that this facilitates potentially heightened awareness of one's own emotions or others' emotions as well. And so the central point of this model, in addition to the adaptive racial and ethnic emotion socialization, is just this role of discrimination in having an impact on children's emotional development. So my work, I hope, moves a little bit beyond this integrative model, and that instead of thinking about this integrative model comes a lot out of answering what we understand about African-American parents' engagement with emotion socialization in comparative studies. So what are Black families doing in comparison to white families in particular? And that these studies are finding that there are higher rates of non-supportive behaviors and lower rates of supportive behaviors with regard to children's negative emotions in particular among Black families in comparison to white families. And even that some of this difference may be partially accounted for by thinking about how parents perceive that there may be negative consequences for their children's emotions. But I argue that the within group studies reveal really interesting variation of emotional behaviors that are more than just suppressed emotion regulation, and that these additional messages and the intent behind them, that they are promoting a toolkit of emotional competence for Black youth. And so in the first part of a study that I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm really trying to answer this question about do African-American parents respond differently to their children's negative emotions in a generalized context versus a racialized context, because I wanted to understand if they're thinking more about the intentionality behind emotion socialization and addressing this particular idea of parents engaging in this relative, more non-supportive response to their children's negative emotions, does that have something to do with the context of which the emotions are either being expressed or experienced? And so in this study, this is with 210 self-identified African-American parent adolescent dyads in the Midwest US. And these data come from wave 1 of a 3-wave longitudinal study. The parents are primarily mothers, as you might expect. And the adolescents are about half and half in terms of the representation of male to female, but these are parent adolescent dyads in which the adolescent is in the 6th grade. Primarily, we do have some 7th graders in the wave 1 of this study. And these data were collected primarily from a school-based recruitment in which we recruited adolescents first and then recruited parents after adolescents had already participated, and data collection happened within schools, but also in other community settings, such as libraries. The data collected from adolescent happened in schools. The data collected from parents happened mostly in libraries, but there were some online surveys also distributed. The sort of main thing that I want to us to take from what the method that I employed to answer this question was for this particular study is this development of a racialized coping with children's negative emotion scale. So some of you may be familiar with the coping with children's negative emotion scale that parents complete to describe the extent to which they would endorse supportive and non-supportive emotion socialization behaviors. They are overwhelmingly, or all of the scenarios that parents are presented with are scenarios in which a child is expressing emotion in a particular sort of generalized type of way in response to not being able to attend a birthday party or losing a prized possession. So generalized situations that children may experience emotions. With the modification to this measure, what I've done is to have the scenarios be all with regard to a racialized or race-based scenario, things that represent the experiences of African-American children that were reported by parents in a previous study that was looking at African-American parents of third graders. And these were experiences that children as young as third grade in some way or another had experienced, or they were scenarios that parents were concerned about their children experiencing. So things about racial teasing, for instance, this first box describes if my child returns home from a friend's house and is sad because his or her friend teased him or her for being African-American, I would. And then they would be provided with 6 potential behaviors that they could endorse to varying extents. So it's not that a parent had to choose one particular behavior that they would engage in, but they were able to endorse multiple ones at various levels. And so I won't go too in depth, particularly with regard to these scenarios, but this is the nature of the measure that I was asking them to complete in comparison to the coping with children's negative emotion scale. These are the subscales of the coping with children's negative emotion scales, and so they are also represented in the racialized version of the measure. On the left side that you see in green, these are considered to be the supportive emotion socialization responses, emotion focused, where you help a child to soothe their emotions or be distracted in some ways from their emotions in a way of helping them to regulate their emotional experience. Problem focused, in which you help a child to focus in on the problem or the thing that is causing the emotion, to address that, to help regulate emotion, and then expressive encouragement, in which parents may encourage a child to sort of in a socially appropriate way express their feelings about what has happened or what's going on or what they're actually feeling inside. So all of these are thought to support a child's emotional understanding and emotion regulation. On the right side in blue, these are what are considered to be non-supportive responses to negative emotions, and particularly the punitive and the minimizing responses. Distress is sometimes a subscale that is often taken out of thinking about non-supportive emotion responses because it may represent parents' own dysregulation in a particular type of way. So if you focus on punitive and minimizing, punitive responses are ones in which a parent is trying to get a child to immediately stop the expression of the emotion by taking away something that a child would like to do, or by sending a child to go and deal with their emotions by themselves away from the social interaction that's happening. Minimizing responses would be a parent trying to get a child to stop that emotion expression by telling them that what they're experiencing is either not a big deal or that the situation is not something to get very upset about. And so again, these are representative of the supportive emotion socialization and non-supportive emotion socialization. So in comparing what parents endorsed in relation to a general scenario versus a race-related scenario, we found that there were mean differences across all subscales. That it depended on what the context of the emotion was being expressed, that parents endorsed these different emotion socialization responses. So for expressive encouragement and problem-focused responses, parents tended to endorse higher expressive encouragement and problem-focused responses in relation to the race-related scenario in comparison to the general scenario. But you see that both of these responses, this response sets are high. This is a scale from 1 to 7. For emotion focus, you actually see that although it is a supportive emotion socialization response, that the responses or the endorsement of emotion focused responses, this this soothing type of response or distracting type of response was higher for general emotion eliciting scenarios than for race-related emotion eliciting scenarios, which is different from what you typically expect, because most of the supportive responses sort of go together. They're highly correlated. The punishing and minimizing responses were actually more highly endorsed for the general scenarios than the race-related scenarios, and then distress was higher for race-related scenarios in comparison to general scenarios. And so what this was showing us a bit is that the context mattered for parents' emotion socialization, which is what we suspected and which is what we wanted to be able to show in this particular study here. And that there are some interesting things about how, for instance, emotion focus, this being a particular practice that African-American parents were not engaging in as highly when it was this racialized scenario. And admittedly, when it's in the context of racial discrimination. And so in trying to understand a bit more about what the findings here were from these quantitative data, we also did a qualitative portion of the study that was not necessarily asking parents specifically about their responses in relation to general and race-related scenarios specifically, but we did ask them about their general emotion socialization and their racialized emotion socialization to be able to understand a bit more fully about why we saw the patterns that we see here. But emotion focus may be serving a different type of purpose for African-American families. And similarly, the distress response also may serve a particular different types of purpose for African-American families when we're talking about race-related scenarios, namely that parents may be unwilling to try to simply soothe or distract a child from the emotion they feel with regard to racial discrimination or a racialized scenario because of the sensitivity in which they also may be experiencing to their child having this this racialized experience, which we think is what is happening with why distress is a bit higher in the racialized experience versus the general experience. So in the follow-up study, what we examined, or the things that I really wanted to know in terms of my research questions, was about how do Black families teach their children about emotion, but specifically with regard to sort of the human experience in general. So what are Black parents saying about how they socialize their children's emotions without me specifically asking about racial discrimination? But then also, what about when I ask specifically about racial discrimination or this racialized aspect of one's life? Is there a particular way that Black families teach their children about emotion as just another experience that may be scrutinized or marginalized because of their group status? And how are those strategies related to Black youth's outcomes? So in this study, in trying to understand Black parents' perceptions about race and emotional development, so from the larger study, that was the longitudinal study, it's the Parenting in African American STEM Success Study. We, excuse me, assessed a subsample of these parents as part of my NSF postdoctoral fellowship, in which these were parents who had completed that racialized Coping with Children's Negative Emotion Scale, but they have also completed a modified version of a meta-emotion interview, which is another emotion socialization tool that's typically used. And so these were 54 mothers of the larger 210, or I'm sorry, 54 parents. 51 of those were mothers. So it's overwhelmingly a mother sample of who came for a follow-up interview. And with regard to the meta-emotion interview, it was a semi-structured interview, and here are sort of the main focal point questions that we're trying to get at understanding African-American parents' emotion socialization. So the first is, tell me about a time when the child was angry, sad, fearful, happy, or proud. So we assessed what parents told us with regard to their child's emotions with these 5 emotions. We asked them to tell me about a time when the child was angry, sad, or fearful, happy, or proud about being African American. And then we ask them, have you ever talked to your child about expressing anger, sadness, fear, happiness, or pride as an African American? We also further ask parents to describe if they had any concerns, if any, about their child expressing these particular emotions as an African American. The emotion also ended allowing parents to talk to us a little about their beliefs about expressing emotions as an African American, just generally, not in relation to their child's emotion expression. From this, we were able to, used thematic analysis and found that there were a number of what we're calling racialized emotion socialization behaviors in that these were emotion socialization behaviors that parents were engaging in, but that they had some messaging with regard to one's race, or they were in the context with regard to thinking about one's race. And so we think about this racialized emotion socialization as this set of emotion related socialization behaviors when emotions are elicited in the context that has a particular degree of racial salience to it. And I won't get into each of these particular types of behaviors in the interest of time, because we're also going to get into some of the beliefs that parents had. But there were a number of strategies that parents described that were reminiscent of the reactions on the Coping with Children's Negative Emotions scale, the racialized version of that. So there were these reactions to children's emotions. There were explicit discussions about emotion, the causes and consequences of that emotion, regulation of that emotion, and specifically with regard to being an African American. So what does it mean when you express your emotion in a particular type of way, but you're also a Black person? How will that be viewed? What does that mean? Could there be different consequences for you than for other people? That's what was happening in the discussion of emotion. For emotion expression, parents also talked about the ways that they modeled their own emotion in the context of perhaps experiencing racial discrimination in front of their child, or in stories that they shared with their child. There's also parents explicitly talking about a selection or a modification of the types of situations they put their children in which children may experience emotion caused by racialized incidents. Some of these were positive things, such as putting their child in certain activities or taking them to museums in an effort to elicit positive feelings and positive emotions about being an African American. There were also ways in which parents were trying to help their children manage potentially negative emotions that they would feel. One mother described trying to shield her child from seeing movies that were about slavery explicitly, or news coverage that was specific to police brutality, because of how upset she knew it made her daughter. And so she would, turn the TV off, she would change the channel, she would try to distract her to go do something else instead of having her be upset by what she was seeing. There were identity-focused strategies where parents were very explicitly talking about bolstering one's pride or racial identity to help their child to cope with emotion during a racialized experience. And then finally, it was quite a bit actually of parents talking about the ways they engaged in storytelling, sharing either their personal experiences or their vicarious experiences with family members or close others. That was all about expressing and managing their emotions in relation to racialized incidents. There were also a number of beliefs that parents espoused during these interviews, things about emotion being a vulnerability for their child specifically, but also for African Americans broadly, ways in which they wished that there was more equality with regard to people being able to express emotion, which was a very human and basic thing, but that the ability to express that emotion freely was only afforded to certain people, but that there should be equality in this is the main point of that. They described emotion masking or suppression as a potential protective mechanism for themselves and for their children. They also described the stereotypes and misunderstanding of African American emotion and what their perceptions were of that. And there were some parents, a smaller number of parents, who described also just emotion transcending race, and very much leaning into the idea that emotion is a human experience, and that race doesn't have anything to do with that. And it's not that it shouldn't have anything to do with that, like an emotion egalitarianism, but they're saying that it doesn't have anything to do with that. And that, you know, people are people and everybody has emotions, and that's the end of it. So I just provide a few excerpts that I will go with. I will maybe read two of these in the interest of time. This is an example of a parent describing emotion as vulnerability. So about the child showing her anger as an African American, this mother says, yes, if someone makes you mad, even if it's like a police officer that you know, they did something that you might not like or something, maybe you shouldn't just like right then and there, you know, just jump overboard with it. Like, don't just jump on it, because the outcome can be bad. Oh, and I can be like, oh, you can go to jail, you can get killed, you know. They want to jump on you, anything. They might treat you a certain way. You never know. They might hurt you in a certain way. So you just might want to be careful, because the way of this world now is kind of dangerous. And when parents were expressing emotion as a vulnerability, sometimes that vulnerability was about the ways that people perceived their child, but there were a number of parents who described it into the most extreme terms, that they described that in terms of how they talked to their children about it, but also in how they thought of it, that this was very much life and death for their children in terms of their emotion being a vulnerability, that if they were to show particularly negative emotion, that this would make them a target for violence, particularly with interacting with authority figures, specifically police officers. With regard to emotion masking and suppression as protection, sometimes this was talked about very explicitly in terms of vulnerability, and sometimes not. So for instance, one mother described talking about her sons, and she said, I do talk to both of them about it, and probably not good sometimes, but I tell them, just try to hold it in so people won't talk about them and they won't get picked on. And so it was just this idea that, again, that they could be a target for potentially ridicule. This was mostly about peer relations and just masking or suppressing one's emotion, but more so in the context of more of the sort of the lower stakes of peer interactions that may be teasing them. And this one is specific to stereotypes or misunderstanding about African American emotion. I think that people feel like all Black men are weak. So when he's showing emotion, then they say he's weak, like, you know, most Black boys are, or in my child's instance, how he shuts down. And then like he won't talk and he'll just be to himself. And then he'll be accused of not knowing how to deal with his emotions, or maybe because his father isn't around because he's Black, or, you know, that just stereotypes that people think that they automatically think, you know, you don't have a good relationship with your parents, or your parents are not good parents because you're having an emotion that everybody else has. And so this was just a misunderstanding of depicting a parent's worry about the misunderstanding of what her son's emotion would mean, just simply about why he was feeling sad. And that there were stereotypes about African Americans that would come into play about that. She was specifically talking about the ways that teachers and other school officials might read her son's emotions, that, oh, he comes from a particularly broken home, or that, you know, because his dad's not around, these are reasons why he would be sad, and not because potentially he's having trouble with the homework that he was supposed to do, or that there was some type of peer interaction that happened that made him sad. So another interesting thing sort of came up for me as I was navigating these interviews with parents, and this was about navigating multiple cultures and managing perceptions, and particularly the ways in which parents talked about that navigation and some of the things that they hoped their children would be able to demonstrate. So for this parent, as I talked to her a little bit about African Americans expressing their emotions, she says, I don't think we know how to really express ourselves. We keep a lot of things bottled in. And so I asked, you know, was there a reason that she thought that that happened? And she said that based off negative perception, because we all want to feel needed and valued. And if it's going to make someone else respond to me in a different way, maybe I shouldn't do it. Because I always tell my child, I'm not telling you not to, but you just have to be mindful. You have to be mindful of your environment. Our emotions aren't for everyone. Everyone's not ready. And so it's this idea that it's this recognition that everyone has emotions, or there's emotion, but we don't always express it. And so this has something to do with the environment. This has something to do with potentially maybe the people that we're around, with this indication of our emotions aren't for everyone not being ready for it. Another parent, when I asked them to think about whether African Americans are just as expressive as other people or more expressive or less expressive, mother said, I think it depends on the situation. In some situations, we probably could be more expressive. We're loud people. I mean, but I'm okay with that. Well, we are. We are just, that's how we are. We are colorful and expressive, and we express good and bad in a loud way. And when there is time to be less expressive, I believe that we do that for fear of, you know, being punished or ridiculed or something like that. So it depends on the situation. I feel like we're just normal, like everybody else. But if we say something, it can be the exact thing someone else said for some reason. It's all blown out of proportion. I have a few other examples of these, but just checking the time, I'm going to sort of move forward and move to this idea of what I was noticing from these conversations had to do with an idea of being able to be flexible about one's emotions. Not that children shouldn't have them, that they shouldn't understand them, that they weren't valuable, but instead that there are places where your emotions are safe to express and places where they're not. It's not always even just about safety, but there's places in which people will understand that emotion in a way that's authentic, and then there will be places where that doesn't happen. And so it started getting me to think more about culture as this contextual background to children's emotion expression and regulation development. And that as the context shifts for youth, as they're engaging for with multiple cultural contexts, for instance, maybe a primarily African-American context versus a primarily white context, that they would be shifting their behaviors and potentially shifting the ways that they express their emotions to be able to meet the needs of those varying contexts. And this is something that was described in triple quandary theory by Wade Boykin and by Boykin in 1986, and some work after, that was specifically in understanding that African Americans as marginalized people had to navigate these multiple cultural experiences. And there was the experience of being an African American. That was just, what is Black culture? What is African American culture? And when I think about this with regard to emotion, is how do Black people in general feel like what is Black culture around expressing emotions? And many parents, in describing that, described it in terms of high emotion expression or authentic emotion expression, and that was important to be able to do, but that there was this tension in navigating the world as a minority, that they had to modify or moderate that emotion expression. And similarly, when interacting with white people in particular, because there were differences in the ways that white people expressed emotion, that to make that interaction go a bit smoother, that there would be ways in which someone needed to modify their emotion expression in particular. And could this particular navigation foster some advanced emotional skill and integration and train youth to develop flexible emotional repertoires such as emotional code switching, or a framework that I'm thinking about more frequently is emotion regulatory flexibility. So this is just a depiction of this model from Bonanno and Burton 2011, but the idea is that and to be able to navigate multiple social interactions, one has to be sensitive to the context around them. And although this model is not explicitly talking about being sensitive to the racial context in which one is navigating or the cultural context in which one is navigating, it, I think, very much applies here. And that the experiencing of emotion, the receiving of emotion, or the understanding of one's emotion, that happens in a particular type of social context, but there are a number of different skills that are necessary to be able to shift one's emotion-related abilities that are happening in one context to effectively move and navigate to the second context. These types of skills are things like regulatory repertoire, so having a variety of different ways in which one can regulate their emotion expression. Expressive flexibility, one's ability to be able to either enhance emotion expression at a time where that is relevant and authentic when is necessary, but to also suppress that emotion expression in a context in which that would be necessary to meet the goals of the interaction or to protect oneself. As well as feedback sensitivity, which would be to, as you're reading sort of the cues in the context of the environment that you're around, understanding when the emotion expression that you have perhaps chosen in this particular context maybe is not as appropriate as you thought. So you're kind of reading, you know, how are people reacting to how you're expressing, and then modulating yourself in that way. This model in particular marries two models, the emotion regulatory flexibility model, but also the affective social competence model that some of you may be familiar with in describing sort of this three-part aspect of emotional competence, of emotional expression, emotional experience, emotion receiving, so understanding emotion, and emotional sending, which would be emotion expression. So these are the particular emotion regulatory flexibility skills that I've talked about a little bit. Sorry, I'm rushing a little bit because I'm recognizing the time. But I think that understanding emotion regulatory flexibility within schools is important for a variety of reasons. One is to think about more broadly things that have been described in the literature before about there being some homeschool dissonance related to cultural values and how this is related to educational outcomes for Black and Brown youth. And this is often talked about in terms of values with regard to education, but I argue that, you know, it's also important to think about this with regard to emotional values and expectations and what is expected of how children handle and express their emotions at home for African-American families, and what their expectations are with regard to authentic emotion expression. But then how will these emotion related values be received for children when they go to school, when they go into contexts in which the racial composition is mixed, or that the teacher is white, or that overall the expectations of schooling is that emotion and the way one handles that looks a particular type of way. And this dissonance likely has some consequences for those implicit biases that I described before about the ways that Black children's emotions are read. But overall, in sort of the ways that I have rushed this talk, my take-home message for you all is just really thinking about African-American parents' intentions behind the ways that they foster children's emotional development, but also the behaviors and context, and that they're doing as they are fostering this emotional development and responding to children's emotions or teaching their children about emotions, that this happens also in the context of racialized scenarios, racialized events, and that there is this balance of emotion and racial socializations, and that potentially context could be key here. Context is something that we're really trying to understand in some of our upcoming work with our family expression and emotional life study, and asking parents really explicit questions about the ways in which they're considering context and race and the ways that they're raising their children around emotions. We think that this has implications for just understanding parent-child dialogues and attending to the emotions that are being sent and elicited when discussing race in particular in our emotional family expression emotional life study. We are really trying to be able to observe parent-child conversations that are about race, understanding what emotions are being expressed there and how parents and children navigate those emotions specifically in the context of racialized discussions. We think also this has some implications for thinking about programs and interventions. I'll just say sort of broadly for culturally relevant socio-emotional learning programming, and trying to understand how socio-emotional competence can be fostered within educational settings. It's important to understand the sort of cultural values and the cultural goals that African-American parents have for their children's emotions, because this is what children ultimately bring into the classroom and then have to find ways to navigate flexibly. And then also just understanding emotional competence in general and flexibility as this understudied asset that honestly, Black scholars have been calling for quite a long time, to be understanding the role of flexibility for Black children as they navigate multiple spaces, but applying that really to emotional competence is necessary. So I can acknowledge many of the research teams that I do this work with, particularly the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context, where I engaged with this work first. But my original family, affect, and beliefs behaviors lab at North Carolina State University, and my own research lab, the SHIELD lab at Virginia Commonwealth University. So hopefully I left enough time that there could be at least a little bit of questioning. I think that we end at 2:15. So I'm not sure how to navigate the virtual space besides saying unmute and ask, please.
Yeah, and I think if anyone's uncomfortable just like unmuting and asking it, because I do think we have a lot of people here, you can also, you know, type stack in the chat or type your question in the chat
Thank
too.
You.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. I have so many thoughts and questions, but I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about what the exact race-related topics or prompts are that you give families when you're observing these discussions?
Sure. So great question. So the an initial prompt for families is based off of their own experiences that they've shared in individual interviews that they've had. So adolescents have their own interview, parents have their own interview, and in each interview they are asked about their experiences with racial discrimination, for instance, and they're also asked about experiences that make them feel good about being an African American, and that if they are able to bring up or recall experiences that fit the bill for what we call the negative discussion, negative racial socialization discussion versus the positive racial socialization discussion, then these are what are used as the basis for their discussion when they come together as a dyad, in which we give each of them about 5 minutes. It's a 20-minute discussion, so about 5 minutes to share what their positive, or we start with the negative, what the negative experience has been, for the parent to share that with the child, and the child to share that with the parent, for them to have a discussion about those experiences, and then they engage in the prompt for the positive emotion, a racial emotion socialization discussion, in which they're describing their positive experiences. And we do tell them to focus or to make sure to describe how they were feeling or how the experience made them feel, and anything that they did to try to manage that feeling that they were having during that context or after that context, and if they sought any support, particularly in the negative scenario. So that is the typical prompt for them. However, if they cannot come up with scenarios or experiences that they would like to share, or they don't want to share those experiences explicitly, then we have backup prompts in which they are engaging with vignettes that are based in the Coping with Children's Negative Emotion Scale, and then a positive vignette describing learning something positive about one's race or ethnicity in the classroom, and having them discuss both of those there.
I think you're next, Garana, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just really excited. I mean, hi. I just feel like you laid out just so much information, and like the thoughts that I wondering about are around positive emotional development, right? So you know, I'm curious about or if you dived into this or know anything about this, how are parents, you know, dealing with their children's positive emotions, right? When they're coming in, home happy, what is the flip side of all of this, right? Because it's I think you mentioned this already, it's always from this deficit model, but what about the flip side, right? And then I also wonder about how you know, Black emotion is also popularized by and like taken and like I want to say like appropriated, is that the right word, where like, you know, to show like actual excitement, you know, it's like, yes girl, and like how other groups are like taking Black emotion and, you know, I don't want to say like stealing it necessarily, but just like taking it and valuing it, but yet devaluing it when Black people express it, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. So both of those things. So for your first point about the positive scenarios and positive emotion expression, yes. So we are actually working on the analysis of just the positive examples as well. We've sort of separated them out because it was really important for us to think really deeply about how are Black families talking about navigating positive emotion expression and emotion experience in relation to being Black. And it's like one of my favorite things in thinking about this Black joy. And that parents, I mean, they just lit up in all kinds of ways when I ask them about the positive emotion that their children experience, just generally, but also in regards to being African American. And so they shared all different types of experiences about times when they were able to do a class report on a famous African American that they really admired, being able to talk to their children about when Barack Obama was president, that these were children who saw a Black president and what that meant for them, the pride that they felt, you know, having their children engage in different types of cultural activities, drum circles or dance troupes and groups, and just the ways that parents themselves talked a lot about sharing in that emotion, trying to elevate that emotion, and really trying to find situations and scenarios. There was a lot of that selection and modification of experiences that was specific to positive emotion there. So much so that, you know, the positive discussions sometimes took longer than the negative discussions because parents really wanted to, I think, just share and the ways that they wanted their children to see themselves in this positive light, and how positive emotion was a way in which they could foster that for their children. And then with regard to Black emotion, particularly Black positive emotion, being either taken up and memeified, if you will, or just used in these ways for other people to express their emotions. Yeah, I've been trying to think a little bit more about this and what does that mean, and how does that make Black folks feel? Because it's another example in which sort of perhaps Black culture is celebrated or taken up as entertainment without wanting to really understand the other types of lived experiences of Black people. We ourselves haven't, you know, talked to parents about these types of images or these types of experiences or perceptions about these things. And it didn't necessarily come up in any of the conversations that we had. But my own reaction to that is just in thinking a bit more about those biases and perceptions that others have about Black emotion, and Black emotion in times of when it is inconvenient or when it is disruptive for people, and times when it's like, oh, this is okay because, you know, people are feeling positively, or this is okay because, you know, the Black person is not angry, so this is an okay thing for us to experience. I don't know, I feel like I have like complex things to say about it and I'm not articulating it well, but I'm happy to connect more because I think you and I are going to meet tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks for answering that question. And yeah, we're meeting tomorrow. I'm excited about it. I have one more question. So on your consent forms, like, how did those go out? Did they say explicitly? I know this is super technical, like explicitly, like we're going to be talking to your kids about race?
Wait, I'm sorry, you broke
On your
up
like,
there.
oh, sorry. So like, this is a really technical question, but like,
yes.
on your like consent forms that you were like sending out, like, did it say like your child is going to be like discussing like their perspectives about like race? And did you have like negative, I guess, reactions to that, or?
No, we did not have negative reactions to that. And when we met with schools to talk about what the nature of the study was going to be, they almost all schools were completely uniformly like, well, this is fine to ask. You're talking to our Black students about this. This makes some sense. There was some hesitancy from some administration about that, but overall it wasn't a big deal. I think we just had really one negative reaction from a parent, and it was a parent of a biracial child that had been marked as Black, just as Black by the school. And so when she received the information form and the consent and all of that for her child to participate, she felt very strongly about her child not being Black and not participating in this study. But overall, Black parents overall did not have any strong or negative reactions to their children thinking about race. And that would even be across Black families that, for instance, in the interviews, discussed not really talking about race as explicitly as other things, that they felt like other identities were more important.
In the chat, we have a question from Amy that's, how should we think about our own work within the context of inherited racial assumptions?
Hi, Amy and Ruthie. I hadn't thought that they would be here. So Amy Halberstadt is my very dear graduate mentor. And so in thinking about that, this context of inherited racial assumptions is such a big question. And I think that it really just calls for us to, number one, to really examine the assumptions of our work, and examining, for instance, work that perhaps relies on more of a deficit perspective, work that relies on a comparative perspective. Particularly, let me go with this idea of the comparative perspective first. And that is for me to first say that in comparative work, it's not that we don't learn things that are useful about being able to compare the experiences of the people across groups. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think it is important. I think that there are things that can be highlighted when we compare across groups, but for that to be the whole basis of the body of work, which is often the case in emotion socialization work, I think just, again, as I've said before, really doesn't allow us to see the nuance to which these behaviors are actually addressing, or the nuance to which those behaviors actually speak to. That we're just missing a lot if all we are examining is thinking about groups as these homogenous beings, when there's so much within group heterogeneity, which is, sort of what prompted this work for me. And so I think that I want to encourage people to challenge those assumptions. If you're doing a lot of comparative work, what does your comparative work what questions are you left with? And you could ask this of any of your work. What questions are you left with? And are you left with those questions because your methods and the way you approach that work didn't allow you to understand the nuance, the complexity with the results that you're seeing in particular? I may not be articulating that as well as I want to right now, but I think that we can learn a lot from the questions that we have remaining from our research. And sometimes those questions that are remaining come from the fact that we've approached our work with a particular type of assumption. And that if we were to think about perhaps the opposite assumption, or we were thinking about those alternative hypotheses, could we come to our work in a different type of way?
I have a quick question too, if we have time.
Yeah.
I see somebody nodding their head. Okay. Yeah, fantastic talk. That was just so much amazing information in such a short period of time. And this is not my field, so I'm completely, I'm in the neuroscience program, so I'm not really sure about, this line of work, but I was really curious about, with the parental responses, I was really curious if the responses, if you looked at that as a function of the age of the parents, if there are parents that were like newer parents, like had children young versus having children older, and kind of having a different historical context maybe for themselves and also their parents, if you're kind of seeing different sorts of, like, I don't know if it would be like considered intergenerational trauma, or just different things that parents are dealing with if they're at different ages, and if you had seen kind of like sex differences or gender differences in the parents' responses too, for the, I guess, mothers versus the fathers. And I guess I was happy that you touched on the heterogeneity of like the community that you're working with, because I do see a lot in the little that I've read about people kind of talking about Black people as a monolith and kind of erasing the fact that there are Afro-Latinx people and Afro-Asian, and we're not all just like the same and don't have the same experiences. So I really love that mention, and I hope that people are keeping that in mind in their research too.
Thank you. Thank you for that acknowledgement, and also thank you for your question. So thinking about, I will address the parent's age first. So we didn't admittedly have a very wide range of parent age necessarily in this study, when there were sort of outliers in age that had more to do with the caregiver, the primary caregiver, or the identified parent in the study being a grandparent. And we had very few grandparents. I think there were 2 to 3 that I recall in the study, at least with that wave 1 sample. And so many times the types of experiences that parents were describing in terms of their own experiences, because sometimes they did describe this, their own experiences with race and discrimination growing up, though they did not tend to vary sort of in the ways that I can at least recall them. But we didn't look explicitly at that because we didn't have a lot of variation in parent age. However, in some really exciting work that I'm getting ready to undertake with a few colleagues, we're writing an RR1 for this, is trying to understand the role of grandparents in racial and emotion socialization among, these are 3 groups of families actually, because we are interested in this intergenerational aspect of both emotion socialization, but also racial socialization, and the intersection of those 2 things, in which emotion expression may have been really particularly something that African Americans would not have wanted to engage in more openly as older generations. So it's something that we're thinking about, but we haven't tested explicitly here. With regard to child gender, the most salient thing that has come out from the qualitative work has specifically been around mothers' concerns about their boys' anger and their sadness with regard to their expression, and what that might mean in terms of them being seen as vulnerable, or what that means for them being target of potential police violence. And this was probably the most enduring sort of gender-related theme that came out of this work, although admittedly mothers did talk quite a bit about anger with their girls as well. So there was sort of this both of these things happening, of like the angry Black man narrative that was pervasive for Black families, as well as the angry Black woman image as well. And also sort of the strong Black woman image for parents of Black girls, and that sometimes emotion suppression or emotion masking also had to do with needing to be strong and needing to raise their daughters to be particularly strong, because things will not be easy. And so it may not always sort of best serve you for you to just express your emotions openly when there are other things that sort of need to be done.
Right. I think we might be out of time. I see Kirby, you asked another question, but I think you both have a chance to meet tomorrow, so maybe we can save that for then. Sorry, we don't have time to get to that. So I'm going to stop the recording for now. And thank you so much, Dr. Lozada, for being here. This was really amazing. And we are really excited that we get a chance to hear from you again tomorrow for your Impacts Talk, which is at 1 p.m. And if anyone needs the link or passcode sent to them, please feel free to contact me. And Tara, did you want developmental folks to stay behind? Okay, if developmental area folks can stay behind for just a few minutes, because Tara has a couple of questions to talk about.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really enjoyed this.